Greetings. Let's welcome everybody to the Big Rethink Interviews. I'm Bryan Alexander. I'm your host today. And with us, we have Christina Benitez and David Staley. Christina, where are you and who are you?
I'm in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I'm a candidate of the Master's in Learning and Design and Technology program at Georgetown University. And I am really honored to be with both of you today.
And we're so glad to have you. We're so glad to have you. David, what title are you using these days?
Well, I'm a associate professor of history at The Ohio State University.
That's right.
But like Bryan, I also dabble, I guess, in futuring and foresight. And I've also been describing myself lately as a higher education theorist, strategist, and designer.
Brilliant. And that is exactly in the capacity that we wanted to talk to you today. We have a set of questions that we will run past you. And these questions will range in scale from the meso to the macro level. And we'd really look forward to hearing your answers. So to begin with, our first question is, what are you seeing in higher education as it responds to two huge developments in this extraordinary year of 2020? One of the developments is, of course, the global pandemic. And the other is the, for lack of a better word, the mobilization against racism that's happening following the killing of George Floyd. And what are you observing in the higher ed landscape as we react?
Well, the first thing that draws my attention is sort of the status of online education and online learning, which of course has been hovering over higher education now for, oh gosh, almost 20 years now. And there are those that are saying that we finally achieved the Peter Drucker moment, right? That online was there was going to be a tipping point where all universities were going to essentially be delivering courses online. And of course, many people are saying we've hit that, or we hit that in the spring at least, when we were forced to take classes or forced to move our classes online. But of course, this is the question that we're asking about the fall. But I think some are also asking about sort of the future. Is this crisis going to be sort of give us the final push to move all of our classes online? I'm not entirely convinced of that. In fact, I think the fall is going to tell us a great deal about the future of online learning. Obviously, there's going to be online learning. The question is it going to become the predominant mode, or a university is going to become predominantly online? And when I say the fall will tell us a lot, I think one of the things we'll have to watch is the reaction of students. Because we've seen, I think, at least some indication from students that they're not entirely crazy about maybe coming to a place like Ohio State if it's going to be online. I could do that, staying closer to home, or, going to the less expensive community college. Mm-hmm. I'm coming to Ohio State because I want an Ohio State experience. I want an Ohio State degree. And that's not an online experience. The fall is going to tell us an awful lot, I think, about the future of online. Like you, Bryan, I've been paying a lot of attention to small colleges. Many of them that were already in a great deal of difficulty before COVID-19. And I almost wonder if some small colleges might actually, and I hate to say benefit, I hate to use the word benefit, but I wonder if small colleges will be able to say, as part of their branding, as part of their marketing, look, we're in the midst of a pandemic. You might want to be in a smaller place it's easier to practice social distancing. And frankly, a small college might be that environment. And I've actually seen a couple of small colleges that have been pushing that line of reasoning. Something else that's been drawing my attention, and that I find maybe somewhat worrisome, is that I think that there are some administrators at institutions that see COVID-19 as an opportunity. The opportunity being to make the kinds of cuts that they were planning on making before COVID-19, but COVID-19 provides the cover, the reason to be able to make cuts. And I see that especially in the kinds of cuts that are occurring, especially in the humanities and the qualitative social sciences and other sorts of areas like this. Again, we were watching those kinds of attempts at cuts before COVID-19, and I think that there'll be some administrators that are seeing this as an opportunity. Speaking of opportunity, I don't know if I'm seeing as much opportunity as I was anticipating in institutions rethinking or reinventing themselves or thinking about innovation. In other words, taking the opportunity of COVID-19 to rethink their mission, rethink what their value proposition is. As you know, I wrote a book a year or so ago on alternative universities and on innovation in higher education. And I suppose one might have thought that the COVID-19 crisis would be an opportunity to sort of visit innovative models, to really reimagine what an institution could be. And I don't know if I'm seeing as many instances as I would have hoped. You had also asked about Black Lives Matter and the whole global uprising, the whole global movement that we've seen over the summer. And I know that at my own institution at Ohio State, we're starting to take very seriously discussions about race in our classes. We're about ready to launch a podcast that's about how do we have meaningful conversations about race in all of our classes. I think that there was an initial impulse to say, well, I'm a chemist or I'm a mathematician, and I can't talk about these matters. And I think one of the things we're trying to do at Ohio State is to say, well, yes, we can. In fact, this is precisely the opportunity to have these kinds of conversations. More globally, I referred to the protest this summer as global. The closest thing that at least in recent memory this comes to is 1968, the 1968 revolutions around the world. And so I wonder if there won't be sort of changes to the university that will be spurred on by this global protest, similar to what we saw in 1968.
Well, that's a fantastic answer. That's a very, very good answer.
Definitely. On that note, I wanted to jump in with a question. In alternative universities, you mentioned that at the core, the search for truth should be the mission of the university. If we accept the truth, as necessitating accordance with reality and fact, and considering these shifting realities that we're dealing with the pandemic and social awareness, what truths are you seeing being discussed across the landscape of higher education, and particularly among leadership?
Wow. Well, that's what an outstanding question, Christina. So you mentioned the quote that I use in my book, and that's from Karl Jaspers, who said rather succinctly and poetically that the purpose of the university is the pursuit of truth. He wrote that in 1946, right after the end of World War II, the collapse of the Nazi regime. And so it had a very particular sort of meaning when he wrote it in 1946. And I think that meaning is just all the more important today, when truth is under assault. I mean, I don't think there's any other way to sort of classify it. And I don't have to spell it out for the viewers of this. The rise of fake news, the difficulty of establishing truth, or the way in which truth is being sort of ripped apart over social media. And in some ways, I think it's up to us, especially in higher education, to maybe reassert the pursuit, the value of truth as one of our highest goals. It hardly needs to be stated, but maybe it does need to be stated again.
Thank you. That's Christina, that's a great question.
It is.
And David, that's a very passionate answer. This leads us to our next question, which shifts a bit from the qualitative to the quantitative. And wondering, as you look at these changes to higher education, what trends in particular are you tracking, and what metrics do you track?
So like you, Brian, I fancy myself a futurist, although not to your degree. And so, like any futurist, I guess, and this is true whatever industry I'm consulting with.
Mhm.
I think that they need to keep an eye very broadly on a number of trends. And the shorthand that we use as futurists is STEEP, right? Society, technology, environment, economy, politics, although I call that geopolitics, we call that STEEP. And so, the trends, the metrics I look at are not just simply those that are occurring or that we think of as tied explicitly to higher education, right? So looking at, enrollment or demographics around traditional age populations, those are the sorts of things that those of us in higher education are looking at. What I tell clients in other industries that I work with is that you have to look beyond your own industry. You have to look at the industries that are adjacent and maybe even non-adjacent to see what's happening there, because oftentimes that's what the source of change, that's where the source of change comes from. I call it strategic peripheral vision, right? Peripheral vision, like our ocular peripheral vision. So I look at technology trends. I pay attention to what's happening, especially on the leading edge of technology. I also I try to keep up on what's happening in sort of society and culture writ large, as again, a way of thinking about its impact for those of us in higher education. And again, these are sort of non-obvious sort of trends, non-obvious sort of areas. And non-obvious, I mean to someone who's sort of immersed in higher education.
Yes.
It's maybe something of an indictment, but I'll also say that one of the things I'm tracking, and a metric I'm tracking in particular in higher education, is who are the strategists? Because I think that if COVID-19 has revealed anything, is that that there were too many people in higher education that were sort of caught off guard by this. And it wasn't just simply higher education. There were a lot of people in a lot of industries, a lot of organizations that weren't thinking through the implications of a global pandemic. Even though, and I know that in the futurist communities that you and I belong to, this is a conversation that we've been having. Oh gosh, how long have we been talking about the possibility of a pandemic?
Decades.
Yeah, I know. And so to think of it as some early on were saying, oh, this is a black swan event. Futurists are saying, no, it wasn't. You weren't listening, weren't paying attention.
Yes.
And so to that end, I know that one of the trends that you're tracking, of course, is in climate change. And again, I think that's something that strategists in higher education just simply aren't paying enough attention to.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And as a fellow futurist, I really appreciate the glimpse of those. I'm also glad to see STEEP getting some love, because that's a very, very useful framework. Well, you mentioned climate change and strategy. So let's expand our vision a bit, and let's think about longer term impact, looking beyond the year 2020, thinking what kind of long-term changes do you anticipate, either for Ohio State, excuse me, the Ohio State, or for higher education as a whole?
Do you mean because of COVID-19 or other sorts of?
Because of COVID-19 and because of this moment of anti-racist activism.
I think that that one of the long-term changes, I think, will come in the definition of what we mean by grand challenges. So at my institution, and I know at a number of institutions, there's been a push, especially in the last decade or so, let's call it, that especially the research missions of our institutions should be pointed to what have been called grand challenges. And climate change was certainly one of those. But there are others, food insecurity. There have been a number of these that have been proposed. And I think that one of the things that will happen certainly is that we're going to redefine what those grand challenges are. And I think that one of them is most certainly going to be sort of global health and the systems of global health. If it wasn't one of the grand challenges, it will most certainly be identified as such. But especially also in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests, I think that it's possible, and I think desirable, that one of the grand challenges is also going to be around the questions of systemic racism. That this will be that the idea of combating or challenging or ending systemic racism gets defined as one of these grand challenges, and not, what we might think of as sort of the usual suspects, and, horrible as they are, food insecurity, global health challenges. I think I would like to see that systemic racism becomes something that the university as a whole challenges, treats as a grand challenge. And as an extension of that, especially seeing how the reaction to the Black Lives Matter protests have been, I think that there are real concerns now about the health of our polity and about sort of the status of our democracy. And again, I would like to see the health of our polity be extended up to be one of the grand challenges that universities are facing. There's another trend that I was following even before COVID-19 that I think COVID-19 has been accelerating, and that's automation, artificial intelligence and automation. One of the things that we've seen as a response to COVID-19 has been increasing use of automation and robots. We've seen this, for instance, in robots being used to clean spaces, public spaces, so that, instead of a human being do it, as a robot that's bringing, UV light across the floor or something like this. Automation was already a trend before COVID-19. COVID-19 could very well accelerate that. And as you know, I've got an article coming out in EDUCAUSE Review that's talking about automation in higher education. We are not ready at all for the impact of automation. And I think we will have to redesign universities around artificial intelligence and automation to educate and prepare for that world.
Those are 4 grand challenges indeed. 2-3 of them really spur or spin out of this moment, but they all 4 really engage with long-running trends. That's brilliant. Our next question, I think in many ways you've already answered, which is which intersections do you see between higher education now and other major huge trends? And you just hit a whole bunch of them. Let me just ask for one more then. How do you see higher education anticipating, responding to the challenges of climate change and climate chaos?
What would I prefer, or what do I expect?
What do you expect?
I expect that there will be minimal sort of reaction because I think, again, as COVID-19 has demonstrated, in higher education, we tend to be more reactive. Especially when the trends to futurists, I think, become so apparent and so obvious that I think we tend to be a little too reactive, and I see that in lots of ways. A lot of institutions think about themselves as being market responsive in terms of their programs and the kinds of outcomes they expect from their students, and I'm not dismissing that, but to be market sensitive really does mean to be reactive, right? To just simply take in, what are the signals of the market sort of telling us, rather than anticipating what could be coming, or anticipating indeed that which the market itself can't anticipate. So my sense is that it will take some of the effects of climate change, and we're already starting to see them in terms of heat. The Arctic Circle is seeing heat of a kind it's not seen maybe ever. I don't think ever. And this is starting to have all sorts of consequences. We've seen the impact of flooding. I think that in some ways, higher education institutions will react to issues rather than to think strategically and proactively about these. And that means more than just simply, we're going to have, let's have a program on climate change. I mean, it does really mean rethinking how we conduct our business. And I know I'm moving into ground that you're treading, because I know that you have a book that will be coming out in this. And so I would say to everyone, listen to Bryan about these sorts of issues.
No one person can do this alone. That's why we need brilliant folks like yourself for that. But a key point is that this is reactive. I guess this sets up our next question, which has to do with kind of the etymology of 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 apocalypse, which is a revelation, right? And so I'm curious about, what does this crisis reveal to you about higher education? And so far, we suggested that it reveals that we are very, very reactive, and that we also um, have made a push to online learning. We've made it, but we might not go all the way. What else has this crisis or these paracrises revealed about higher education?
So I've been maybe slightly negative. So let me say something positive, because I really do think this. So before COVID-19, there was a general sort of, well, malaise or even attack on higher education. We don't really need higher education. Not everybody needs to go to university. There are all sorts of alternate pathways. And I think that, and the fall again is going to bear this out, that that we're going to see that not only do we continue to need higher education, but that it is even more important and valuable today than in what it was before COVID-19. There is, it's, you know, it's still summer. It's still the summer. There's concern as we record this today about what's called summer melt.
Mm-hmm.
That while there might be students that are signing up for fall classes, that they won't actually sort of show up for various reasons, either because they don't want to take online classes or they think it's too dangerous to be on campus. But one of the things I'm anticipating, and maybe it's a little bit of wishful thinking, but my sense is that the melt isn't going to be as terrible as people think.
Mm.
And I think it's because there's still a demand, there's still a desire for higher education. And if anything, we may take COVID-19 as an opportunity to sort of say, boy, this is why this matters so much. This is in part why there's such a push. We need to reopen. We need to reopen. I think because there's an understanding broadly that higher education is important and that it matters.
Well, I hope so. I like your optimism.
I'd like to think that it's going to counteract this "who needs higher education" mantra. I'd like to think that's what's going to happen.
Well, I really do hope so. We have a whole set of questions that follow, and some of them are zooming into a bit more detail. And before we get to those, I'm wondering, Christina, can you put to David this question about mashups? It's just a great, thoughtful question. You're muted, I think. I think you're still muted.
Sorry about that.
There we go.
So in your speculations, designs offered in your book from last year, which mashups do you think would be the most sustainable and adaptable for what is needed in higher education today?
Oh, goodness.
I'm really excited to hear this.
So I've been asked before about what my favorites are. And so I'm going to take this as an opportunity to sort of tie this in, because it is one of my favorites, is the idea of micro college.
Mm.
And I've actually had a few people reach out to me about during COVID-19 about the idea of what would it take to sort of start up a micro college. For your viewers who haven't read the book, micro college is the idea of building a college around 20 students and 1 faculty. And that's a college. And in fact, the model for this already exists, Deep Springs College in the Sierra Nevadas. The idea would be that you would have, you know, hundreds, thousands of these small institutions. Because I really do think one of our reactions to COVID-19 is going to be rethinking density, not just simply urban density, but maybe even the big scale universities, you know, where tens of thousands of students attend. And I think that there's going to be there will be a market, there will be a group of people that would welcome the idea of being in a smaller setting, maybe socially distanced, whether that's over Zoom or in a setting where they could sort of space out more. But I think an enterprising institution that wanted to establish a micro college would find this an opportune moment.
Thank you. And I think that also ties in well to how some colleges are conceptualizing the hybrid model and having students mostly, even those who are on campus, mostly take virtual classes, but then come to campus for 1 or 2 classes with sort of a more isolated interaction.
I've had this experience that I think ties in with what you're talking about, Christina. So I host, there's a global event series called Creative Mornings. I host Creative Mornings Columbus. I know there's a DC chapter. One of the things so we've moved our events into Zoom, as everyone else has. One of the things that we've noticed is that about 10% of the people that attend our weekly or our monthly events are not from Columbus. They're sort of eavesdrop, and we welcome them in. Just this past Friday, we had an event. There was someone there from Mexico City. We had someone from Stockholm, someone from New York City. And not everyone, but I think there's a sense that since we're now holding more of these sorts of events in these sorts of formats, well, maybe I can sort of step into an event somewhere on the other side of the world. And I wonder if there's not an implication there for schooling. Rather than this being sort of an occasional event, you're in Washington, I'm in Columbus, we actually set up institutions where the classroom involves people from all over the world. And that we architect such a space like that, so that it's not just let's invite a guest from Australia or from Oman. Let's architect a space where that kind of global environment is what the classroom environment is like. And I wonder if our COVID-19 moment doesn't give us the opportunity to do that.
I agree, and I think there's exciting possibilities as well. My career has been in higher education, and most recently as an academic program manager. When we transitioned to virtual learning, I saw this also as an opportunity to engage our alumni virtually. And so creating opportunities for alumni based all over the world to connect with the class that was about to graduate for advice and so forth. So I definitely agree that there's some exciting possibilities for opportunity in this new space.
I know that Zoom is getting tiresome for a lot of us, right? We went through this, thank goodness for Zoom, we can still hold our classes, and then everything was on Zoom. But I really do think that this is going to be, even post COVID-19, I think that more of our lives, and our professional lives, and I think our educational lives, are going to occur like this. Now, whether it's going to be in the flat screen of a Zoom meeting, there's been some talk about that this is VR's moment, that the three of us could be having this conversation in a three-dimensional space that's like a meeting room, except we're doing it through VR. I think that there are, yes, like Bryan is doing here. While we might say today, as of this recording, that we're tired of Zoom, I actually think that this becomes more commonplace in our professional and our educational lives. And I think designing for these kinds of educational environments becomes the next challenge, especially for instructional designers.
That's actually not just a fantastic answer and a great vision. And Christina, thank you for the question and the follow-up. But it's also literally an uncanny setup for our next question. We're kind of, at this point, we narrow the iris of our camera lens down a bit. We try and focus on a few different aspects of higher education. And one of them is we wanted to ask, what can the instructional design profession contribute to higher education through this transformative period? And we're thinking about this in part because of the program that Christina and I are in. Learning Design and Technology is focused in part on instructional design, but there are also adjacent professions like academic computing and educational technology. But what can this instructional design mode, what can that contribute to how higher education changes in this year?
Well, in many ways, this is already your moment because we've been relying upon online educational design, instructional designers throughout this whole crisis, and I don't see that abating. I just don't see that abating. We are going to be drawing upon instructional designers like no other time. We've already talked a little bit about this. I think that that what I'm calling Zoom globalization becomes a sort of a new normal that I think that we'll have to start thinking about in terms of an educational environment. But even before COVID-19, I think that that instructional design was ready for a sort of new horizons, and not just simply inside traditional higher education.
Mm,
So let me explain what I mean by that.
mm,
One of the trends I've been paying attention to is what's happening in corporations around upskilling, what's being called upskilling.
mhm,
And that's not just sort of retraining. I mean, it's the idea of preparing their workforces, especially for an automated future. So lifting the skill level of all their employees. Amazon are set to do this. Starbucks have been engaged in this. And the scenario I've been writing about is what I'm calling the new corporate university. There are already corporate universities, but it's a new type of organization within corporations that's engaged in not just simply training, but in things that we would look like, things that look like, well, frankly, our business. The sorts of things we do in higher education could very well be the sorts of things that corporations are doing. And my sense is that corporations that are really gearing up their training component, that are establishing their own corporate universities, are going to need instructional designers. And so I think it's very, very plausible that that someone training today in instructional design could end up working at Georgetown or at Ohio State, but could just as easily work at Honda or Amazon or any other corporation. And I think that there are, I think that, frankly, I think there's a lot of growth potential there. The same goes, by the way, I think for faculty and for administrators. I think there's every reason to think that corporations will start rating our world for these increased training possibilities.
that's good news for LDT grads
It should be.
and and for all of us. And it's great to spread that wealth. Thank you again for the positive vision. Let's take that narrow focus and let's slide it over to a different side. This is a question about science. Um, and one of the things that we've seen in 2020 is this boom in skepticism about science, in part or largely aimed at different responses to COVID-19, but also to a degree aimed at the social science behind the Black Lives Matter movement. So a question we wanted to ask is, how does the skepticism that's emerged, what does it tell us about how academic science crafts its messages or how it achieves persuasion in the broader world?
It's such a good question. I think a simple or simplistic answer is that our messaging and persuasion has been ineffective. Uh, but let me give a deeper and I hope more hopeful answer. So, in the early stages of the pandemic, at least in this country, one of the scenarios that I was writing had to do with sort of the future of science, the future of expertise, in exactly the way that you've been talking about it here. So as you know, Bryan, I write a monthly column for a publication here in Columbus on the future, and it was going to be in my column that that we could see a future where, because of COVID-19, science and expertise is sort of vindicated, and this sort of attack or this rejection of or skepticism
Mm,
sort of falls by the wayside
mm,
because of the way in which science and expertise was marshaled to handle the pandemic. And just before I published it, I started to see evidence that that was not occurring at all. And
mm,
in fact, if anything, we've seen a kind of a hardening of anti-science rhetoric.
mhm,
Um, in really some ugly and awful ways. I would like to revisit that scenario. I'd still like to think that it will be an outcome of this, but our experience of the last few months have signaled even a sort of a hardening of the skepticism, even when the science is so life-saving, and we don't have to go into all those details.
yeah.
Frankly, I see it as one element of a larger phenomenon I'm tracking, And this is one of those scenarios where I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. And it's a sort of a symptom of declining U.S. global power and influence. Part of our influence and our strength globally has been not just simply the size of our military, but the strength of our scientific infrastructure. And I think if the pandemic has revealed anything, it's how broken that is. The CDC is no longer looked upon as sort of a global the global guide. And I think that's a horrible thing for this country. I mean, it signals something really quite awful about our power and influence. As a reaction, you asked the question about our messaging, or how do we, our acts of persuasion around sort of science and expertise. I think that academics will have to think very differently now about access to power and even holding power. We like to talk about speaking truth to power. I think that for some of us, we will need to think of one of our objectives as an academic would be to sort of exercise power, to run for office, to be in Congress or in the Senate, where political leadership becomes a goal of being an academic, rather than being sort of at some sort of distance from that world. I think that we will, some of us, not all of us, but that some of us will need to practice policy and political authority, and that those of us in academia will need to see that as something valuable and something that we reward.
That's quite an ambitious challenge for higher education.
I'm nothing if not ambitious.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that vision. We have one last general question, and then we have two more questions aimed right at you and at your work. So I want to get to this general question first. The digital divide is something that really has been defamiliarized this year. It's been made really stark and clear just how unevenly broadband access, and not just broadband access, but also access to hardware and skills, how unevenly that is distributed across the US. And I'm wondering, what are your observations about the digital divide? What have you seen this year in the US and abroad, if you want to speak to that?
So I think that one of the things that COVID-19 has done has bifurcated the nature of work. And so this exercise, for instance, is sort of proof of that. We are privileged enough that we're able to conduct our professional lives over Zoom or over other such environments. And there are a number of professional people that have been able to relatively seamlessly move their professional lives into an online environment. And one of the things that I've been writing about lately is that is actually a common pattern across plagues throughout human history. That when a plague strikes, the wealthy or the privileged are able to sort of flee the city. Mm-hmm. Either to vacation homes or to villas they might have. Mm-hmm. And that COVID-19 has given us sort of the digital version of this. Mm-hmm. So if you are so privileged to be able to conduct life in this sort of environment, you move into it. The other side of that are those that have to continue working in the dangerous sort of real world or the physical world. And one of the things that COVID-19 has revealed is that the reason that unemployment skyrocketed the way it did is that the bulk of the jobs in this country are sort of out in public like this. And so if you look at like Bureau of Labor Statistics information, cashiers and fast food workers are some of the highest occupations or highest number of people engaged in these occupations in the country. And of course, they were some of the first that were impacted by this. Yeah. So this is where the digital divide has, I think, been most clearly demonstrated. If you have the privilege to be able to work professionally online, you have that opportunity. there's a trend I'm watching right now in Japan.
Ooh.
There's and I'm not going to remember the name of it. It's a, sort of a convenience store, sort of like 7-Eleven in Japan.
Mhm.
They've started using robots to sort of be the cashiers
Mhm.
in these convenience stores. Those robots, though, are being operated by an employee at some distance. And so it's not full automation, but that worker who would have had to have to wear a mask and be out in a dangerous public environment can now be sitting in the relative safety of their home and operating like the way a drone operator operates at some distance. This person can be taking cash or pointing people. That's where the chips are. And that's really very interesting, but I think it also points out something rather significant. That person who works at a convenience store has to have access to technology and VR. It's done by VR. That to me strikes me as a huge assumption. The person who has to work at a convenience store, do they have the access to the broadband and the technology to be able to work at a distance like that? That'll be the new kind of digital divide, I think, that we'll see.
Have you seen this? There's a Mexican film from 2005 or so called The Sleep Dealer. Have you seen this?
I've not.
It's a very interesting film. Christina, have you seen this?
No, I haven't.
It's a scary future where America builds a Trump-like wall with a border with Mexico, but still needs Mexican labor. So what happens is Mexican laborers work in Mexico and teleoperate robots in the U.S. And I don't want to say anything more spoiling it. It's a fascinating film, but just
Adding it to my watch list.
Me too.
yeah, see what you think.
Professor Staley, you mentioned, speaking about the digital divide, you have often mentioned in your writings that students and faculty should be able to leave an institution a different person than when they arrived. And given this shift to virtual learning, do you believe that transformative and equitable education is possible when students do not have access to the transformative spaces for exploration and, when they're learning from home?
Wow, this is a terrific question. And I think it is actually at the heart of online learning. Because I've seen hardly any instances of this. So we can design online learning but I've yet to see the online space. And maybe it's going to be something that is synchronous and in fact over an environment like Zoom. But not, I've yet to see the online experience that has the same sort of transformative experience as we have in face-to-face. And I think that whoever can design that is, to be crude about it, they're going to make $1 billion. Because I really do think that is, that's going to be a key. One of the challenges I think that online learning has faced, and part of the reason why people have been so resistant to it, is that it's seen too much as just merely transactional, as opposed to transformational, which is why you hear professors say nothing is going to replace the face-to-face experience. When that transformative online experience is designed, then we really will have hit a tipping point, I think. But your observation is an absolutely correct one, I think, Christina.
Thank you for that insight. I think we're definitely also seeing a lot of more attention placed on not just the need for access, but also having the tools available to
Yes.
have that access. There's a really compelling piece in the New York Times that was posted 3 days ago about how in some communities that are on that side of the digital divide, families have had to go to parking lots or to Starbucks for Wi-Fi in order for their children or students to be able to do homework and access their learning systems.
My classes in the spring, I was teaching small seminars, 15, 16, 17 students. And so when we moved into Zoom, because we'd been together for 2 months or so, it was relatively painless for us to do that. We sort of continued on. We found out very quickly that the kind of camaraderie and deep conversation that we were able to have face-to-face, we could do that online. One of my students moved back home to Southeast Ohio, which if you don't know the geography of Ohio, that's Appalachia. That's hills and mountains and relatively poor and a connectivity desert. And he was I had a student who had real difficulties being a part of our class. He couldn't have video. He can only do voice, and his voice was really choppy, and and it was just, he couldn't have the same sort of experience as the rest of the class could. And for me, that really laid bare very much the impact of the digital divide.
That's a very, very stark difference from Columbus.
Indeed. And you're only going, an hour and a half. I mean, it's not like you're not going that far at all. But it could be, it is a real difference outside Columbus.
I can imagine. I'm just reflecting back on my own learning journey and thinking about what would have been the impacts for me if this pandemic had happened when I was in high school or in undergrad. It's particularly freshman year of undergrad. That's such a transformative time to find your voice and to really begin to advocate for yourself. And it would have been quite devastating to not have that access to transformative.
This would have happened in 1990 without Zoom. What would we have done?
Yeah.
I shudder to think what we have done.
Well, shudder is the right word. We would have closed.
Yeah.
There aren't many antecedents to think of, but I think of a lot of Southern campuses during the U.S. Civil War, for example, would shut down, and I think there would have been no alternative, really.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the internet, but it was used by very, very few people. This is before the web, so it's a good alternate history example to think about. But that does bring us to a historical question. And this is one I wanted to target at you as a historian, as someone who connects the history and the future. But Christina, you can phrase this better than I. You're very curious about David's linkage of historical knowledge and future imagination. Do you want to say more about that?
Sure. I was thinking about, you have suggested that historians may best imagine the future, and wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more, and what can the past teach us about the unfolding future of virtual learning that we're seeing today?
So maybe you'll permit me a little bit of a personal biography before I answer that. It is a way to answer that. So I knew after I graduated high school and before I started college that I wanted to be a futurist. That summer I worked a job, I sold produce by the roadside. And so I had a lot of time to read that summer, trust me. And I read all three of Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy books that summer. And by the end of the summer, it's like, I wanted to study psychohistory. I wanted to be a futurist. And of course I got to university and there is no major in futuring. And I eventually ended up in history. I won't say only because of that, but one of the reasons I ended up in history, I think, is because it was maybe the closest to what I thought psychohistory and the future was really all about. And I've only been strengthened in that conviction, especially after I encountered the work of Peter Schwartz, who about 30 years ago wrote The Art of the Long View, who said that that thinking about the future really means thinking in terms of scenarios rather than predictions. And it was somewhere along the lines of like page 37 or so in that book, where he said, engineers don't get the practice of scenarios, but historians do. And I said, well, yeah, because what you're doing when you say scenarios is you're talking about writing histories of the future, doing what I do as an historian, except thinking forward rather than thinking backward. And so when I say that historians make good futurists, this is the sort of thing I mean, that it's not just simply patterns in the past that we can use to project forward. Right. It's the particular way in which historians think about how we study the past that's particularly good for thinking about the future. And as historians, what I've been saying to audiences recently is that a futurist is almost like a counterfactual historian. In other words, a counterfactualist sits at some point in the past and says, well, what if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated? What if the bullets had missed? What would have happened next? And there's a whole sort of subgenre, subfield in counterfactual history. Well, in a sense, that's what a futurist is. A futurist is now sitting in the moment and thinking, what could possibly happen given our contemporary moment? And so that's what I mean to say that historians are already well trained, I think, to think about the future, the particular way in which we think about the future, especially when you get out of the habit of thinking that thinking about the future means making a prediction. Because any decent futurist will say they can't predict the future. And anybody that does, I think, is lying to you or lying to themselves or selling snake oil. And so that's why I think historians make good futurists. And I would expand that, I think, maybe to be people in the humanities as well. I know Bryan's background is in English. I think that having a background in the humanities makes one particularly good, especially at dealing with the uncertainty that the future represents.
I was going to say, being on the humanities job market will definitely give you that sense of uncertainty. That's a wonderful answer, and I love the vision of you selling produce with a copy of Asimov under your arm. That's a great image.
Thank you. Very compelling.
I'm conscious of time, and we're at the last 2 minutes, and I wanted to add one last fillip of a question. I've asked a couple of folks about this. We like to say this is an unprecedented time, but I always like to look back in history for precedent. And I'm curious, what, thinking about academia in this role, or in general, what kind of precedents do you find from the historical record? I mean, you mentioned 1968 briefly.
Yeah.
I mean, I mentioned the Civil War. I mean, what do you think? Where should we turn for some insights?
So the simplest one, I suppose, is the pandemic of 1918. So I teach a course on the history of the Ohio State University, and the pandemic has always been about like 5 minutes of a lecture I give. And now the pandemic of 1918, the flu pandemic, is much, much, much larger. And I think we can learn a lot. You had mentioned previously, Bryan, that if we didn't have Zoom, we would just shut down our universities. Well, Ohio State was, in fact, shut down in September of 1918. Not for the entire fall semester, but for a good portion of it, I think. And so I think we can learn a lot about how universities dealt with pandemic by looking that way. I mentioned 68, and maybe I can elaborate a bit on that, because we would oftentimes, as historians, we talk about like the 1968 generation. There were a generation of student leaders, for instance, the ones who were, again, and this was a global phenomenon, those that were leading protests against all sorts of things, but even against sort of the structure of the university itself. And I think that we could learn a lot about sort of the aftermath of 1968 for universities. Again, in my history of Ohio State class, we talk a lot about the impact of the riots. We had riots in 1970 after the Kent State shootings, just up the road here. And this university was shut down for 3 weeks because of this. But after that happened, there were all kinds of changes. In fact, a lot of the things that the students were protesting, this university made a lot of changes that had all sorts of effects. And I think that that's one of the things that we could look at today. What will be the changes that especially the Black Lives Matter protests are going to portend for the university? And I guess a bigger question, who will be the leaders? If we talk about the generation of 1968, what is the generation of 2020 look like, and what is their impact going to be?
The generation of 2020. I love that. Well, we've taken you to the end of the hour at breakneck speed, and you have given us so many thoughts, so many ideas. David, thank you very much. I really appreciate this. You mentioned a podcast that you are you currently recording this I mean, not the second, but are you still running the podcast?
We are, yes. So I'm the host of Voices of Excellence in the Arts and Sciences.
Very good.
And I interview my colleagues across the College of Arts and Sciences at Ohio State. In fact, I did an interview this morning. Part of the reason why I have the microphone out. I did an interview this morning with a novelist, but I interview physicists and astronomers and artists and chemists, and it's one of my favorite activities. So thank you for allowing me to make the plug.
Well, it sounds great. And I look forward to plugging it into our ears as we go. Christina, David, thank you both for a superb hour. I'm really looking forward to the conversations that this provokes.